The Mangar brothers had been in Europe during the war. Kolo was a fighter pilot. Dede worked for the SOE, Special Operations Executive in France, and they came back to Mauritius in the late 40s, and they had a lot more experience and networks than many other Mauritians, and they basically built Rogers. Kolo, his interests were shipping. Caltex, Dede Mangar, his interests were tourism, hotels, all the sort of general sales agencies for the airlines, had British Airways, had Air France, and he was the founder of Air Mauritius. Basically, Rogers, in the 50s and 60s, it was the most diverse and the biggest conglomerate in Mauritius. And by independence, in 1968, it had achieved this status. But in 1968, Rogers was taken over by Lonrho. This was Tiny Rowland. He was a very high-profile chief executive, and Lonrho worked in Africa, and he wanted Rogers because he had his eyes on the hotels, and he thought he would develop the hotels in Mauritius. And he was already invested in Mauritius. They had Anglo Ceylon, which had sugar estates. The Mangar brothers were interested in the capital they thought that Lonrho would bring, and therefore this seemed to be a golden opportunity to diversify their risk. In 1972, Lonrho had a cash crisis and decided to sell their shares in Rogers. They actually were going to sell them to Blythe Brothers, because Blythe Brothers were working, in fact, with South African breweries in those days, and they wanted to go into the hotel business. And however, Blythes were the great competitors to the Mangars, and Kolo went off in search of, I think you call it a white knight, someone to save them from Blythes. And who did he find? He found Maurice Espitali-Noel. The price to buy 44% of Rogers was 11.5 million rupees. It sounds not very much now, but in those days it was a fortune. Maurice Noel, he said yes, he was interested, but he wanted to bring the tailors into the deal with him. And we formed a joint venture called Amalgamated Enterprises, where we were 50-50. That was in 1972. If you look at in 1970s, there were a number of different businesses that have been brought in, Taylor Smith, for instance, but they merged with Deugelis-Bayville, with Rouget Feder, with Goupy, and each of the people that were running the businesses when they went into Rogers continued to run the businesses. So there was little integration. Today you would call it an investment a group rather than a conglomerate. The 70s for Mauritius was a very bad time in terms of the economy. It was bad for the private sector. It was bad for individuals. Gaëtan Duval very much believed in an open Mauritius, an open economy. He believed in the private sector, and he was the man, in fact, leading this. Although he was the junior partner, he was the man that wanted Mauritius to develop. And the Minister of Finance was one Vishnu Lakshminaraydu, and Gaëtan Duval. They worked together. The taxes came down. It was also a propitious time in terms of the world economy. Mauritius was a signature to the Lomé Convention, which gave goods produced here tax-free and quota-free entry into the European Union. There was heavy tax duties on stuff going from China. And of course, at that moment in time, Britain was negotiating pulling out of Hong Kong. So there was uncertainty at the level of manufacturing in Hong Kong, China, and quite a lot of the business people there came to Mauritius to set up industries. In the 80s and 90s, Mauritius expanded very, very strongly. The growth of the economy was nearly double digits every year. All the Rogers businesses were basically linked into the Mauritian economy, which is normal. So, the cement was good, the shipping was good. So Rogers expanded very, very strongly in the 1980s into the 1990s. Kolo Mangar stepped down as the chief executive in 1980, Christian Coicot stepped up, and in 1983, Derek Taylor became the CEO of Rogers. Now, Derek, he believed in diversification. He believed in empowerment. He believed in giving people, he knew he couldn't do it all himself, so he gave his managers a lot of leeway to do what they wanted to do. Derek stepped down in 1999, and I stepped up. In 1999, when we looked at the profits being made by the profitable companies and the losses being made by the loss-making companies, we found a third of the profits were being eaten up by the loss-making companies. So when I came in, we looked at a number of things. Firstly, we had a big, very comfortable cushion. Our investment in Beachcomber and Mauritius hotels. Rogers actually controlled Mauritius hotels, and that was doing well. In 1999, we unbundled that, and each Rogers shareholder got Mauritius Hotel shares. So without a cushion, we had to have better performance from the Rogers businesses. Less diversification, more rationalization, more focus, and actually doing stuff better, less stuff better. I was the head of Rogers 1999 to 2006. And basically that's what we were doing. We sold the shipping businesses. We had a number of sales engineering businesses that we actually sold. When I left in 2006, I was glad to say there were no loss-making businesses. Now, when Philippe took over, of course, he did other things, and I have to say that I think what he's done is fantastic. When you look at Essentia, when you look at the fact he's grown his logistics, he's grown all his various businesses, this is very good. When I joined Rogers, there was little ethnic diversity at the level of management. And one of the things that I wanted to do in Rogers was to make Rogers more inclusive and more ethnically diverse. And we succeeded. And, frankly, we were the first to want to actually do that. I believe that really, especially as we were the biggest company in Mauritius, if people couldn't aspire to work with us and for us, this was wrong. And we opened up, and, Rogers became a great training ground for people. Lots of people that I've met over the last 20 years, I've been nearly out of Rogers for 20 years now, a lot of them started their careers there, worked there for 4 or 5 years, and they always speak well of it. It's seen, it was seen as a good employer where people were properly treated, and I think that was important. And the other thing we led on was on governance. Corporate governance really started in the early 2000s to be seen as something important. Before that, no one really cared, who your director. Well, the directors were all, basically members of the family, and whether they were good or bad, etc., and how old they were didn't really matter. In fact, I was made the president of the National Committee of Corporate Governance, and Rogers, I think in the early 2000s, we very much led the way in governance. And governance today, as you appreciate, is seen as being important. In the private sector, I think a lot of advances have been made in terms of corporate governance. That was something that Rogers led the way on. And I think we also, in terms of Mauritian society, we did our best. When something was proposed, I always used to say, yeah, well, it may be good for us, Rogers, but is it good for Mauritius? And if it wasn't good for Mauritius, I preferred not to do it. So I think we did take a responsible attitude to things. Partnerships, they're like marriages, aren't they? The marriage is meant to be till death do you part. But when you look at partnerships in business, you are partners for long as it works for both of you. And in 2012, we were trying to get a shareholders agreement between the Taylors and the Noels, and we were struggling to get this agreement. And I think there was a conversation that Philip had with Colin when we couldn't get the agreement. So Colin asked Philip, do you really want to be partners with us? And Philip said, well, not necessarily. Yeah, we could separate. And that's how we started to look to see whether we could separate. And we basically agreed to split the business. Each one would keep the minority shareholders, and the Noels, they took everything to do with aviation, tourism. They love land as well, so they took Bellom. The Taylors, we took the global business, and we took SIM, and a few other things as well. We never regretted. I don't think the Noels ever regretted, because they've gone very much and built on what they took. So yeah, it worked for us, it's worked for them, and it was done in relative harmony, I would say. The other thing I think I'd like to say is that I always believed in value rather than control, which is very un-Mauritian. Most Mauritians believe in control. If you were a Rogers shareholder in the 1990s, today, you'd still have your Rogers shares, you'd have your Sim Financial Services shares, you'd have your NMH shares, you'd have your Lavastone shares. So, the Rogers shareholder got very, very good value from the various moves that were made over the years. And that, I think, also was important. Looking after the shareholder was an important part of what we were trying to do. You should always treat people the way you want to be treated. That's very important. I also believe you need to look at what you want to achieve, decide on how to do that, and then look how it affects people, and then how can you actually compensate the people who are negatively affected. If you start by looking at the people, you actually never do anything, because no one likes change. So it's important to actually look at the change you want to make, and then see how you look after the people who will be affected. What else? Oh, keep your promises, even the small ones. You forget it, they don't. So it's actually very important to keep your promises. I come back to the inclusiveness. I come back to treating people properly. Rogers does still have a good reputation. I have a friend who worked in Rogers at one stage. He doesn't anymore. And he told me when he was at university, his ambition was to get a job at Rogers. That was his ambition. I mean, it's an Indo-Mauritian, so it means that it really was seen as somewhere that you could go and work and you could do well. And I think it is still seen like that.